Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Last night, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde cancelled thousands of procedures. We know the SNP's flagship Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is already the worst performing in the country. And this morning, there are reports of nurses at the hospital working 24-hour shifts. It's disgraceful to put NHS staff in that situation. And despite their incredible efforts, it could be harmful to patients. A whistleblower has said this, their words: "We are struggling to cope." In short, we are struggling to provide first world care in what feels like a third world environment. Given this, how can the First Minister say the Health Secretary has done all he can to support NHS staff and prepare for this crisis?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, in relation to reports in the media this morning about staff in Greater Glasgow and Clyde being asked to work 24-hour shifts, that, as I am assured by NHS Greater and Glasgow and Clyde, and as the board has said publicly, is not true. Let me just quote NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. There is absolutely no truth to these claims. The NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde does not ask nursing staff to work a 24-hour shift, and there was no prospect that any staff member would need to work for 24 hours. To suggest otherwise is inaccurate and misleading. And I would not expect any health board to request any member of staff to do that. Secondly, Presiding Officer, staff across the National Health Service in Scotland, indeed staff across the National Health Services in England, Wales and Northern Ireland are struggling right now. They're doing an extraordinary and a magnificent job, and my heartfelt thanks go to all of them. But they are struggling in the face of unprecedented pressure on our National Health Service, pressure from COVID, even more so in recent weeks from flu and, of course, from other respiratory illnesses. We hope that pressure will abate in the weeks to come, but in the meantime, the Government continues to do everything possible to support NHS boards as they address those pressures. Now, lastly, Presiding Officer, in relation to the announcement from Greater Glasgow and Clyde last night, as I said on Monday, we have empowered NHS boards to take action that they think is appropriate to protect critical and life-saving care. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has paused non-urgent elective procedures in order that they can prioritise urgent treatment and cancer care, and I would expect that to be for a very short period. And finally, this is my final point, Presiding Officer, I think it insults people's intelligence to suggest that the problems being encountered in the NHS in Scotland, which are the same as the problems being encountered elsewhere, are somehow down to the Health Secretary. Is it, for example, the fault of Humza Yousaf that the kind of action that Greater Glasgow and Clyde announced last night has also been taken in health services in South London, in Surrey, in York, Scarborough, in Derby, in Leicester, in Nottingham, in Southampton and in Portsmouth, and I probably could go on. These are unprecedented pressures which we continue to support our NHS to address.
Douglas Ross.
How can Nationalist MSPs actually clap such a despicable answer from Scotland's First Minister in Scotland's Parliament about Scotland's National Health Service? So let's ignore the Nationalist MSPs. Let's look at what medical professionals are saying. They are damning about this government's response to this crisis here in Scotland. On Monday, the First Minister placed some of the blame for the grave situation in A&E departments on, in her own words, unnecessary attendances. But Dr Leila Peel, Deputy Chair of BMA Scotland, criticised patient-blaming language, saying, and these are her words, "It shows a lack of understanding of the current crisis." We've analysed the figures, and Dr Peel is spot on. There are actually fewer people in A&E now than there were in the years leading up to the COVID pandemic. The problem is not unnecessary attendances. Fewer people attended A&E in the first week of this year than they did in 2020, 2019, 2018 or 2017. So will the First Minister accept that the blame lies with her government and not the patients?
First Minister.
Nobody, including me, certainly not me, is blaming patients. It is the case. Well,
let's hear the First Minister. Thank you.
Unnecessary visits to accident emergency, unnecessary attendances and admissions to hospital are not in the interests of patients. That's why we are working hard to make sure that where patients can be and should be treated elsewhere, that happens. Now, let me just take the points made by Douglas Ross in turn, and let's look in detail at demand and why the figures that he has quoted are actually the case. There is absolutely no doubt that demand on our health service right now is higher than it has been for some time. If we look at calls to NHS 24 over the festive period, the highest demand in a decade. If we look at emergency calls to the Scottish Ambulance Service, higher in the most recent week than the average of the 4 weeks before that. The reason that they are not all translating into attendances at accident emergency or admissions to hospital is because of the work NHS 24 and the Scottish Ambulance Service are doing to avoid that. So the NHS 24 now provides advice and, where necessary, treatment to the vast majority of patients during the initial call that they make. In terms of the ambulance service, most of the calls to the ambulance service are treated through see and treat, so the patients are not taken to hospital. But those, because of that, those who do go to hospital tend to be sicker and their length of stay is longer. That is part of the reason we have pressure on our hospitals. And the waiting times in E&E, of course, are a reflection of the fact that occupancy in our hospitals are so high, which is why we are focused on speeding up discharge from hospital where appropriate. And finally, Presiding Officer, we listen very carefully to, engage with, work with health professionals each and every single day, and it would be hard for me to find the words appropriate to describe my respect for our health professionals. But of course, elsewhere in the UK this week, we've seen healthcare professionals on strike. They've not been on strike in Scotland because of the work this Health Secretary has done and because of the respect that we have for our healthcare professionals.
Douglas Ross.
I think those words may come back to haunt the First Minister, but, you know, if we're judging Cabinet Secretaries on sector striking, I would hate to be Shirley-Anne Somerville right now, I've got to say that. And we've just heard it. The First Minister is doubling down on her patient-blaming language. The problem is not too many people attending A&E. The problem is this government's handling of the NHS crisis here in Scotland. Dr Peel said exit block is the problem in A&E. And the government have known this has been a huge issue for years. The First Minister was defending her position in the last answer by saying people are getting sicker, but people healthy and ready to go home can't get out of hospital because the First Minister and her government haven't dealt with bed blocking. They were failing to tackle this before the COVID pandemic, and now it's worse than ever. New reports today state that the number of avoidable deaths is now 60 people a week in Scotland.
Shocking.
That's 60 families across our country grieving every single week the loss of a loved one who could have been saved. So, First Minister, will you confirm those tragic figures?
First Minister.
What I will absolutely confirm is that when people wait too long for treatment, that has severe consequences potentially for patients. That is why we work so hard and will continue to work so hard with the health service to reduce long waits for treatment, whether that's an accident emergency or whether it is for elective care on our National Health Service. Now, I wasn't, to use Douglas Ross's phrase, doubling down on anything, and I certainly, for the avoidance of any doubt, I am not blaming patients for anything. It is in the interests of patients to make sure that, where appropriate, they can be treated treated outside of hospital, because it's not in the interest of any patient to end up in an accident emergency unit or in a hospital ward just because treatment is not available in the community. What I was doing was trying to, because it's obvious from his questions that Douglas Ross doesn't understand this, explain the flow of patients through our National Health Service and why we see longer waits in accident emergency. It's because of over-occupancy in our hospital wards. And finally, on the exit block, the significant chunk of what I and the Health Secretary set out on Monday was about tackling delayed discharges. Now, we understand from our daily engagement with health boards that we have seen delayed discharges reduce slightly in recent weeks, but there is much more to do. So that was the reason for the interventions and the additional funding that I indicated on Monday and the Health Secretary set out to the Chamber on Tuesday. So we will continue to be focused on providing the support and making the interventions that are necessary right now to help the NHS during this period of unprecedented demand. And let me remind Douglas Ross and the Chamber, unprecedented demand that is being faced not just in Scotland but all over the UK and indeed in much of the rest of the world as well.
Douglas Ross.
The First Minister can throw insults at me if she wants. I was quoting well, she laughs at this. You can laugh at that, First Minister, if you want, but I was quoting a frontline doctor in Scotland's NHS who happens to be the Deputy Chair of the BMA in Scotland. But the First Minister effectively confirmed those tragic figures we heard this morning are correct. 60 avoidable deaths every single week in Scotland's NHS, confirmed by Scotland's First Minister. And Scotland's Health Secretary is making the situation worse, not better. Here's just one example of what we're experiencing across Scotland. On Hogmanay, a family visited their 80-year-old uncle. He's had major heart surgery, hip operations, and often struggles to breathe. When they arrived, they discovered he'd fallen and broken his neck. The family dialled 999 7 times, and it took more than 12.5 hours for the ambulance to arrive. 7 emergency calls, 12.5 hours for our 80-year-old who had broken their neck. His niece told us the ambulance crews were brilliant, but we are disgusted at what our uncle has been put through. This dire situation confirms yet again this Health Secretary and this government is not on top of this crisis. His failures are creating risk to lives across the country. First Minister, surely for the good of Scotland, it's time to sack Humza Yousaf.
First Minister.
If I raised a smile in response to Douglas Ross, it was not directed at any health professional. I suppose what I was raising a smile about in very challenging circumstances where everybody right now is Douglas Ross accusing anybody else of insults. I think that is... Every single day with the Health Secretary will continue to take the actions that are necessary to support our NHS during these very difficult times. I said earlier on, and I don't take anything for granted, and I am not intending to sound complacent at all about this, but it's because we respect so highly those who work in the front line of our National Health Service that we are offering them right now a much higher pay increase for next year than any other government anywhere else in the UK, and thus far we have avoided industrial action in our National Health Service, and we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that continues. We're also supporting health boards to address the reasons for long waits in our National Health Service, whether that is waits for an ambulance or waits in accident emergency or long waits to be discharged from hospital. That's why we announced the action that we did earlier this week. There are too many patients right now waiting too long for treatment, and we will continue to do everything we can to address that, while we hope these pressures caused by COVID and by flu in the main abate over the weeks to come. But that should not take away from the fact, and this is true in the ambulance service, service. It is true in our accident and emergency units. It's true in our GP practices. It's true across our hospitals and other healthcare settings. The vast majority of patients in this country, even during these extremely difficult times, get excellent care on our National Health Service, and that is down to the dedication of those who work in it, and that's why they have my grateful thanks each and every single day.